Chapter 4: The United States and Iran, Visions of Order. In the spring of 2013, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a figure of greater political consequence than all the state ministers, including the Iranian president and foreign minister, addressed an international conference of Muslim clerics. He proclaimed the onset of a new global revolution. The events that other nations called the Arab Spring, he asserted, were in fact an Islamic Awakening with momentous implications for the entire world. The West, he argued, was mistaken in believing that the crowds of demonstrators were advocating for the triumph of liberal democracy. Khamenei explained that the protesters were rejecting the sad and horrific experience of following the West in politics, behavior, and lifestyle, as their presence in the streets was a miraculous fulfillment of Allah's commandments. Today, a picture is unfolding before our eyes that no truly knowledgeable person with an open mind can deny. The world of Islam is emerging from the shadow of the social and political arrangements of the superpowers. This world has found its place, important and defining, at the center of fundamental events. It offers a new perspective on life, politics, governance, and social needs. In Khamenei's view, such an awakening of Islamic consciousness marked the dawn of a global religious revolution that would finally end the dominance of the United States and its allies, bringing a close to 3 centuries of Western rule. The Islamic Awakening, which the arrogant reactionaries in the West do not even mention, is evident to all, and its signs can be observed throughout almost the entire Muslim world. Most indicative is the enthusiasm with which the public, and especially the youth, is embarking on the revival of the glory and greatness of Islam, through which they examine the foundations of the international system of domination and tear off the masks, exposing the shamelessness and hypocrisy of governments that continue to pressure the Islamic and non-Islamic East. Following the collapse of communism and liberalism and amidst the decline of Western power, the Islamic Awakening would resonate worldwide. Khamenei promised a global unification of the Muslim Ummah, the creation of a transnational community of believers, and the restoration of its central position. The ultimate goal can only be the creation of a great Islamic civilization. All constituent parts of the Islamic Ummah, in the form of various nations and countries, must strive for the result set forth in the Holy Quran. Through true faith, knowledge, morality, and constant struggle, Islamic civilization can bestow upon the world advanced intellectual achievements, establish noble standards of conduct for the Ummah and all humanity, and serve as an impetus for liberation from the materialistic and repressive views and corrupt policies that underpin modern Western civilization. Khamenei had spoken on this subject before, as he informed delegates at a convention of Iranian paramilitary forces in 2011, protests in the West were evidence of a global spiritual hunger and a search for legitimacy embodied in the Iranian theocracy. A world revolution was just around the corner. Events in the US and Europe suggest the grand changes the world will see in the near future. Today, the slogans of Egyptians and Tunisians are being repeated in New York and California. The Iranian Republic is now the focal point of the awakening aspirations of peoples, and it is precisely this reality that so upsets our enemies. In any other region, such statements would be perceived as a revolutionary challenge, a theocrat possessing supreme spiritual and temporal authority, representing a major player on the world stage, publicly articulating a project for an alternative world order that refutes the one recognized by the international community. Effectively, the leader of Iran declared that universal religious principles, rather than national interests or liberal internationalism, would dominate the new world whose emergence he predicted. Had an Asian or European leader voiced such thoughts, they would have caused a shock. However, 38 years of similar slogans have accustomed the world to the Iranian leadership's radicalism in word and deed. For its part, Iran combines its defiance of modernity with a millennia-old tradition of exceptionally subtle statecraft. The Tradition of Iranian Statecraft. The first practical implementation of radical Islamist principles as state doctrine occurred in 1979 in the capital of a country where it was least expected, a nation which, unlike most Middle Eastern states, possessed a long and storied history and had always manifested a profound reverence for its pre-Islamic past. Thus, when Iran, which had existed as a legitimate state within the Westphalian system, suddenly transformed into a champion of radical Islam following Ayatollah Khamenei's revolution, the regional order in the Middle East was overturned. Among all the countries of the region, Iran possesses perhaps the most cohesive sense of national identity and boasts the longest tradition of governance based on national interest. At the same time, Iranian leaders habitually reach far beyond Iran's modern borders and rarely adhere to Westphalian concepts of statehood and sovereign equality. Iran owes its origin to the Persian Empire, which, considering all its incarnations from the 7th century BC to the 7th century AD, held sway over most of the modern Middle East, as well as territories in Central and Southwest Asia and North Africa. Brilliant art and culture, a multi-layered bureaucracy, vast experience in governing remote provinces, and a massive multi-ethnic army hardened in successful campaigns. As a result of all this, Persia grew accustomed to regarding itself as exceptional rather than merely one among many. The Persian ideal of monarchy elevated the ruler to a quasi-divine status as the benevolent lord of many peoples, the king of kings, who dispensed justice and practiced tolerance in exchange for peaceful political submission. The Persian Imperial project, much like that of classical China, represents a form of world order in which cultural and political achievements and psychological confidence play a role no less significant than traditional conquests. The Greek historian Herodotus, 5th century BC, described the self-assurance of a people who had adopted the best of foreign experience, Median dress, Egyptian armor, and now considered their empire the center of human achievement. The Persians honor most, after themselves, naturally, their nearest neighbors, then those further off, and then the rest in order of distance. Those who live farthest from them are held in least esteem. In their own opinion, they far surpass all other men in the world in every respect, while others, they believe, possess merit in proportion to their distance. Those living farthest away are considered the most base. This sense of inherent superiority endured for approximately 2.5 millennia, as evidenced, for instance, by the text of an 1850 trade agreement between the United States and the Safavid dynasty, which ruled a truncated but still vast Persian Empire, encompassing Iran and significant portions of modern Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkey, and Turkmenistan. Even after the recent loss of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Dagestan, and eastern Georgia in 2 wars with the expanding Russian Empire, the Shah radiated a confidence befitting an heir to Xerxes and Cyrus. The President of the United States of North America, and His Majesty as exalted as the planet Saturn, the sovereign to whom the sun serves as a standard, whose splendor and fortune are equal to that of the heavens, the sublime sovereign and monarch whose armies are as numerous as the stars, whose greatness calls to mind Jamshid, whose magnificence equals that of Darius, the heir to the crown and throne of the Khianids, the illustrious emperor of all Persia, being equally animated with a sincere desire to establish friendly relations between the two countries, which they wish to strengthen by a treaty of friendship and commerce, mutually advantageous and useful to the citizens of both high contracting parties, have for this purpose named as their plenipotentiaries. Situated at the crossroads of East and West, governing provinces and dependencies that stretched from modern Libya to Kyrgyzstan and India, Persia became either the starting point or the ultimate objective for nearly every Eurasian aggressor, from antiquity to the Cold War. Despite all upheavals, it managed, much like China, which endured roughly comparable trials, to preserve its sense of identity. By conquering extremely diverse cultures and regions, the Persian Empire adopted their achievements and synthesized its own concept of world order. Even when crushed by foreign conquests,
the campaigns of Alexander the Great, the first wave of Islamic expansion, the Mongol invasion, events that nearly obliterated history and political autonomy of other peoples, Persia nevertheless maintained its conviction of cultural superiority. It submitted to conquerors as a temporary concession, but guarded its independence of mind, outlining great internal spaces in poetry and mysticism, and honoring an unbroken link to the heroic ancient rulers mentioned in the epic Book of Kings, Shahnameh. Simultaneously, it accumulated experience in territorial administration in overcoming various political challenges, formulating a sophisticated diplomatic canon that extolled patience, shrewd analysis of geopolitical realities, and the ability to psychologically manipulate adversaries. This sense of exceptionalism and deft maneuvering survived into the Islamic era, when Iran adopted the religion of its Arab conquerors, but alone among the first wave of conquered peoples, defended its native language and infused the new order with the cultural heritage of the empire the Muslims had just destroyed. Gradually, Persia became the demographic and cultural bastion of Shiism, initially providing refuge to dissidents fleeing the Arab majority, and then from the 16th century making Shiism the state religion. In part, Persians became Shia to differentiate and oppose themselves to the rising Ottoman Empire, which was Sunni. Unlike the vast majority of Sunni interpretations, the Shia branch of Islam emphasizes the mystical, ineffable component of religious experience and proclaims the permissibility of prudent concealment of beliefs, taqiyya, for the sake of realizing the interests of the faithful. In culture, religion, and geopolitical positioning, Iran, the official name of the country since 1935, maintains its tradition of exceptionalism and never tires of asserting its special regional role.
The Khomeini Revolution. The 20th century Iranian Revolution occurred during the reign of Shah Reza Pahlavi and began, at least as it was portrayed in the West, as an anti-monarchical movement. Revolutionaries demanded democracy and the equitable redistribution of economic wealth. Many of these grievances were entirely justified, as the ongoing modernization program exacerbated social inequality, and the Shah's government exercised despotic control over dissent. However, when Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in 1979, having spent many years in Paris and Iraq, and claimed the role of supreme leader of the revolution, it quickly became apparent that he was not interested in social issues or democratic governance. Instead, he challenged the existing regional order and the very institutional mechanisms that sustained it. The doctrine adopted by Iran under Khomeini differed radically from any employed in the West since the end of the Wars of Religion and the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. Khomeini's doctrine treated the state not as a legitimate entity in its own right, but as a convenient weapon in a broader religious struggle. The 20th century map of the Middle East, Khomeini declared, was a pro-Islamic falsehood concocted by imperialists and self-seeking tyrants who had divided the Islamic Ummah into pieces, forcibly torn it apart, and created artificial nations. All modern political institutions within the Middle East and beyond were to be deemed illegitimate because they did not rest upon the commandments of Allah. Modern international relations, based on procedural Westphalian principles, were built on a false foundation, for relations between nations must develop based on spirituality rather than on the assertion and observance of national interests. Khomeini's position, comparable to that of Sayyid Qutb, was that an ideologically correct, expansionist reading of the Quran pointed the way to deliverance from all such blasphemies and the creation of a truly legitimate world order. The first step would be the overthrow of all ruling regimes in the Muslim world and the ascension of an Islamic government. Traditional national loyalties were to be discarded, for it is the duty of each of us to overthrow the taghouts, the illegitimate political forces that currently rule the Islamic world. The establishment of a truly Islamic political system in Iran would signify, as Khomeini stated during the celebrations marking the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran on April 1, 1979, the dawn of the first day of the rule of Allah.
This doctrine stood in stark contradiction to all other modern concepts of statecraft. As Mehdi Bazargan, Khomeini's first appointee to the post of prime minister, told the New York Times, "We sought, as it was portrayed in the West, the type of governance that existed for 10 years under the Prophet Muhammad and another 5 years under his son-in-law, Ali, the first Shia Imam. When governance is conceived as divinely inspired, dissent is naturally perceived as sacrilege, and political opposition is simply not permitted." Under Khomeini, the Islamic Republic of Iran began applying these principles in practice, leading to a wave of denunciations and executions, and to systematic repression of religious minorities far more brutal than under the authoritarian regime of the Shah. Against the backdrop of these events, a new paradox emerged, a dualistic challenge to the international order. Through the Iranian Revolution, an Islamist movement aimed at dismantling the Westphalian system gained control over a modern state and seized its Westphalian rights and privileges, a seat in the United Nations, participation in international trade, and diplomatic status. Thus, the clerical regime of Iran positioned itself at the intersection of two world orders, utilizing the available advantages of the Westphalian system while simultaneously denying its legitimacy, publicly declaring its meaninglessness and inevitable demise. This duality became firmly rooted in state doctrine. Iran began officially calling itself the Islamic Republic, implying that it did not recognize current territorial demarcations. The spiritual leaders at the head of Iranian power, first Khomeini, then his successor Ali Khamenei, were presented not merely as political figures, but universal leaders, the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution and the leader of the Islamic Ummah and of all oppressed people. The Islamic Republic burst onto the world stage by flagrantly violating a fundamental principle of the Westphalian international system, diplomatic immunity. Iranians stormed the American embassy in Tehran and held its staff hostage for 444 days. The current Iranian government takes pride in this assault. Otherwise, it would not have appointed the individual who served as an interpreter for the hostages in 1979 as Iran's ambassador to the United Nations in 2014. Furthermore, in 1989, Ayatollah Khamenei assumed the role of a global authority by issuing a fatwa, a religious decree, containing a sentence for Salman Rushdie, a British author of Indian Muslim descent, for publishing a novel in the UK and the US that the Ayatollah deemed offensive to Muslims. While maintaining standard diplomatic relations with countries where extremist groups operated, Islamist Iran supported radical organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Mahdi Army in Iraq, armed formations that opposed their governments and regularly resorted to terrorism. Tehran's drive for Islamist revolution allowed for cooperation between Sunnis and Shias in the name of creating a broad anti-Western coalition. For instance, Iran supplied weapons to the Sunni jihadist group Hamas, which was at war with Israel, and, according to some experts, supplied the Taliban in Afghanistan. The 9/11 Commission report and a 2013 report on a terrorist plot in Canada prove that al-Qaeda militants also found refuge in Iran. On the necessity of overthrowing the existing world order, Islamists on both sides, Sunni and Shia alike, were in agreement. However great the tensions between Sunnis and Shias in the Middle East at the beginning of the 21st century, they are remarkably close in their perception of Sayyid Qutb's ideas that are virtually identical to those voiced by the Iranian Ayatollahs. Qutb's writings are widely distributed in Iran, some of which having been personally translated by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. As Khamenei wrote in 1967 in the preface of Qutb's work, The Future of the Faith, this insightful and great author has attempted in his book to show the essence of faith as such, and then, having formulated this, to draft a program for life, to confirm with his eloquent style and worldview itself that ultimately the world government must be ours and that the future belongs to Islam. For Iran, embodying the hopes of the Shia minority, victory can and must be secured by putting aside doctrinal differences in the name of achieving common goals. Accordingly, the Iranian constitution proclaimed the unification of all Muslims as a duty of Iran. In accordance with the sacred verse, all Muslims constitute a single ummah. The government of the Islamic Republic of Iran is obligated to ensure that its general political line is based on the alliance of Islamic peoples. It must exert maximum effort to realize the political, economic, and cultural unity of the Islamic world.
Iran and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The future of Iranian-American relations depends, at least in the short term, on the resolution of what is largely a technical problem of a military nature. As I write these lines, potentially epochal changes are occurring in the regional military balance and in the psychological equilibrium. This is linked to Iran's rapid evolution toward nuclear weapons status during negotiations with the permanent members of the UN Security Council in Germany, the P5+1. Remaining in the shadow of discussions regarding technical and scientific capabilities, this issue is, in fact, the focal point of international order. At stake is the international community's ability to enforce legitimate demands in the face of truly sophisticated defiance, the clerical regime's actual readiness for cooperation, and the prospects of a nuclear arms race in the world's most unstable region. The traditional balance of power rests on military and industrial might. It can be altered only gradually, or through conquest. The modern balance of power reflects the level of scientific development and can be threatened by developments within the territory of a single state. No conquest could have bolstered Soviet military power more effectively than the drive to break the American nuclear monopoly in the late 1940s. Similarly, the proliferation of nuclear weapons cannot but affect the regional balance and the international order and will trigger a series of active counteractions. Throughout the Cold War, American leadership constructed its international strategies within the context of the fearsome concept of mutual deterrence. We understood that a nuclear war would entail casualties on a scale comparable to the demise of humanity. Furthermore, the leadership realized that a readiness to resort to extreme measures, at least up to a certain point, was essential if we wished to prevent the world from sliding into ruthless totalitarianism. Deterrence within these parallel nightmares was possible because there were only two nuclear superpowers on the planet. Each conducted comparable assessments of the risks of using nuclear weapons. But as soon as nuclear weapons began to spread across the globe, the policy of deterrence started to become a fiction, and the very concept of deterrence lost its meaning. In the modern world, it is already very difficult to discern who is deterring whom and on what grounds. Even assuming that new nuclear nations would conduct the same survival calculations as the USSR and the US regarding military actions against one another, a highly dubious assumption, these countries would still be capable of undermining the current international order in several respects at once. The difficulty of protecting nuclear arsenals and facilities, as well as creating complex warning systems modeled after advanced nuclear states, increases the chances of war breaking out due to the temptation of a surprise attack and a preemptive strike. Moreover, nuclear weapons can be used as a shield against attacks by extremists, and other nuclear powers will not be able to ignore an atomic war on their borders. Finally, the experience of private nuclear proliferation from the technically US-friendly Pakistan to North Korea, Libya, and Iran has the gravest consequences for international order, as the proliferating country is not formally considered a pariah state. On the path to creating one's own nuclear potential, three obstacles must be overcome: acquiring delivery systems, establishing the production of fissile materials, and beginning the production of warheads. Regarding delivery systems, there is today an extensive open market where the primary sellers are France, Russia, and to some extent China. Primarily, financial resources are required. Iran has already acquired the initial technology and can develop it at its own discretion. The technology for producing warheads is also not a closely guarded secret, and such production itself is relatively easy to hide from observers. Perhaps the best, if not only way to prevent the emergence of a new nuclear power is intervention in the uranium enrichment process. A necessary element of this process is the use of centrifuges, devices that produce enriched uranium. The enrichment of plutonium is also dangerous and likewise is discussed in irrelevant negotiations. To prevent the development of Iran's nuclear potential, the United States and other permanent members of the UN Security Council have been conducting negotiations for more than a decade, spanning 2 administrations on both sides. Since 2006, 6 UN security resolutions demanded that Iran cease its uranium enrichment program. 3 American presidents from both parties, all permanent members of the UN Security Council, including China and Russia, and Germany, as well as the leadership of the International Atomic Energy Agency, have and continue to state that Iran's possession of nuclear weapons is unacceptable and Iran must immediately cease uranium enrichment. And to achieve this goal, no means are considered impermissible, in the words of 2 consecutive American presidents. There is a visible, steady development of the Iranian nuclear program occurring against the backdrop of a gradual softening of the Western position. Whenever Iran ignored UN resolutions and constructed centrifuges, the West put forward a series of proposals, each time raising the degree of the permitted, at first insisting that Iran completely cease uranium enrichment, 2004, then allowing the possibility of producing low-enriched uranium, LEU, less than 20%, 2005, then suggesting that Iran export the bulk of its LEU stocks so that France and Russia could produce fuel rods with 20% uranium, 2009, and finally agreeing to allow Iran to retain sufficient LEU stocks to operate a research reactor, on the condition that Iran cease activity at the Fordo centrifuge complex, 2013. This complex was once considered a secret facility. After the plan's discovery, the West persistently demanded its total closure. Now, Western conditions allow that the complex's operations might merely be suspended, with guarantees making a restart difficult. In 2006, the P5+1 group was established to coordinate the international community's positions, and its representatives demanded that Iran halt its nuclear program before negotiations began. By 2009, no one even mentioned this condition. In such a situation, Iran naturally has not the slightest reason to perceive any initiative as final. Acting with dexterity and audacity at every stage of the crisis, it has shown less interest in compromise than the group of Western powers, thereby securing ever more concessions. When negotiations began, Iran had 130 centrifuges. At the time of this writing, the number of centrifuges has reached approximately 19,000, only half of which are in use. Before the start of negotiations, Iran lacked the capacity to fissile uranium. In the interim agreement of November 2013, Iran acknowledged possessing 7 tons of low-enriched uranium. Given the number of centrifuges in the country, this stock could be weaponized within a few months, and it would suffice for the production of 7 to 10 bombs similar to the one dropped on Hiroshima. True, Iran promised to eliminate about half of its stock, but not directly. The 20% uranium is merely converted into a form from which it can easily be restored to its original state, and Iran possesses this capacity. In any case, with such a number of centrifuges, enrichment to 20% already appears insignificant, since uranium enriched to 5%, the threshold value touted as an achievement by the negotiators, can be enriched to the necessary degree within those same few months. The viewpoints of the representatives from both sides at the negotiations reflect differing interpretations of world order. The Iranians have effectively stated openly that they will not abandon their chosen course and are not intimidated by possible attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. The Western negotiators are convinced and, emphasizing their commitment to peace and diplomacy, periodically say so aloud, that the consequences of a military attack on Iran are incomparable to the risks of the further development of Iran's nuclear potential. Their arguments are bolstered by a professional mantra: there is a way out of every dead end, a new proposal for which they bear responsibility. For the West, the primary question is whether a diplomatic solution is possible or whether military measures will be required.
In Iran, however, the nuclear program is viewed as one point in the struggle for a new regional order and ideological dominance, a struggle waged everywhere and by all means, both peaceful and military, from paramilitary operations to diplomacy, formal negotiations, propaganda, and political subversion, with all these methods equally reinforcing the overall effect. In this context, the drive for an agreement must take into account that Tehran will at least explore the chances for an easing of tensions to rid itself of sanctions while preserving its nuclear infrastructure and maximum freedom of action, only to return to the realization of the nuclear program later.
Under the interim agreement of November 2013, Iran agreed to suspend uranium enrichment in exchange for the lifting of some international sanctions imposed for violating UN Security Council resolutions. But since the agreement allowed Iran to continue enrichment for another 6 months, the term of the arrangements will expire by the time a permanent agreement is supposed to be ready. The practical consequences are clear. The West has de facto recognized the Iranian nuclear program and stopped specifying, as it was once said here, its scope. Negotiations for a permanent agreement continue. The terms, or at least the possibility of formulating them, remain unknown, but it is clear that they, like much in the Middle East, will touch upon a red line. Will Western negotiators, on behalf of the P5+1, insist that restrictions applied to the enrichment process as formulated in UN resolutions? This is an exceedingly difficult task. Iran would have to reduce its number of centrifuges to a level consistent with plausible figures for a civilian nuclear program and destroy or mothball the rest. Such an outcome, the effective abandonment of a military nuclear program, offers the prospect of a fundamental change in the West's relations with Iran, especially if the parties also agree to jointly combat the Sunni and Shia militant extremism that actively threatens the region. Given the repeated statements by Iran's supreme leader that Iran will not relinquish the capacities it already possesses, statements bolstered by explanations from a host of senior Iranian officials, the Iranians, it seems, intend to negotiate for a refusal to produce warheads, or for a reduction in the number of centrifuges to a minimum that allows for a return to the realization of a military nuclear program if necessary. Under such a scheme, Iran will demonstrate to the international community its fidelity to its leader's fatwa against the production of nuclear weapons. The text of this fatwa has not been published, and no one has seen it, only Iranian leaders. It is ready to undertake obligations to forego the creation of nuclear weapons and to permit inspectors to monitor compliance with the agreements. Of course, everything will depend on the amount of time Iran would need to create a nuclear weapon after violating the agreements, should they be signed. Iran managed to build 2 secret uranium enrichment complexes right in the midst of international inspections. Therefore, in preparing an agreement, the possibility of similar actions on its part in the future must be taken into account. And Iran must not be left as a virtual nuclear power, for this country is capable of becoming nuclear far faster than any non-nuclear neighbor could prepare for such an eventuality, or any nuclear power could intervene. Iran is implementing its proclaimed goal of undermining the state systems in the Middle East and displacing the West from the region with exceptional skill and dexterity. It doesn't matter whether it creates and tests a nuclear weapon in the near future, or merely preserves such a capability. The consequences of such an outcome for regional and global orders are comparable. Even if Iran satisfies itself with the potential chance to create a nuclear weapon, it will have achieved this despite the most comprehensive international sanctions ever imposed on any country. Iran's geostrategy competitors, namely Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, will also set about developing or acquiring nuclear weapons, for the desire to catch up with Iran will become irresistible. The risk of an Israeli preemptive strike will increase significantly. As for Iran, having withstood the sanctions and established a nuclear arsenal, it will bolster its authority, intimidate its neighbors, and exacerbate its capabilities for traditional methods of warfare.
It has been argued that a new approach to American-Iranian relations will take shape during the nuclear negotiations, potentially compensating for the West's retreat from its historical positions. Frequent reference is made to America's relationship with China, which evolved from hostility to mutual recognition and even cooperation over a relatively short period in the 1970s. Iran, it is sometimes suggested, can be persuaded not to brandish its virtual nuclear club so provocatively in exchange for goodwill and strategic cooperation with the United States. The comparison, alas, is flawed. China faced 42 Soviet divisions on its northern border following a decade of escalating mutual enmity, and internal turmoil had begun to take hold. It had every reason to seek an alternative international system in which to anchor itself. In the West's relationship with Iran, such obvious incentives for cooperation are absent. Over the last decade, Iran has witnessed the collapse of its 2 most significant adversaries, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. ironically both overthrown by the Americans, and has strengthened its influence and military presence in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Its two current primary competitors for regional influence, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, are preoccupied with internal problems, while Iran rapidly overcame its own, apparently successfully, by suppressing the opposition during the democratic uprising of 2009. Iran's leaders are accepted in respectable international society without being required to make any significant changes to current policy, and Western companies were ready to invest in the country even during the period of sanctions. Surprisingly, the rise of Sunni extremism along Iran's borders might give Tehran pause, but it is just as likely that Tehran views the current strategic landscape as shifting in its favor and its revolutionary course as entirely vindicated. Exactly which option Iran chooses depends on its own preferences, not on American perceptions. To date, Iran and the West have invested their own separate meanings into the very concept of negotiations. American and European negotiators spoke with cautious optimism about the prospects of a nuclear agreement and exercised maximum restraint in public comments in the hope of fostering a favorable atmosphere, whereas Ayatollah Khamenei described the nuclear talks as part of an eternal religious struggle where negotiation is a form of combat and compromise is impermissible. In May 2014, 6 weeks before the expiration of the interim agreement, the supreme leader of Iran reportedly described the nuclear talks as follows: "The reason we seek to continue the fight is not that the Islamic leadership is bellicose. It is simply logical, when crossing a sea infested with pirates, to be fully equipped and ready and able to defend oneself. In such circumstances, we have no choice but to continue the fight and allow this fact to define the country's domestic and foreign policy. Those who seek compromise and wish to surrender to the occupiers, accusing the Islamic Republic of warmongering, are in fact committing treason. All officials of the country, whether engaged in economics, science, culture, politics, lawmaking, or foreign negotiations, must realize that they are at war and are continuing the struggle for the creation and survival of the Islamic system. Jihad will never end because Satan and the Satanic Front will exist forever."
For nation-states, history plays the same role that character does for a person. In the case of proud Iran, with its rich history, one can distinguish 3 periods, 3 interpretations of world order. The policy of the state that existed before the Khomeini Revolution consisted of guarding its borders, respecting the sovereignty of other countries, and a desire to enter into alliances, in effect, pursuing its own national interests within the framework of Westphalian principles. The Imperial tradition, however, places Iran at the center of the civilized world. The autonomy of neighboring countries, in this view, is to be eradicated wherever possible. Finally, there is the jihadist Iran described above. From which of these traditions do current high-ranking Iranian officials draw their inspiration? If we believe a radical change has occurred, what brought it about? Is the conflict psychological or strategic? How will it be resolved? Through a change in relationships or a change in policy? If the latter, toward what specific change should we strive? Can differing views on world order be reconciled? Or must the world wait until the jihadists' fervor is exhausted, as happened previously with the Ottoman Empire, due to a change in power dynamics and domestic priorities? The future of U.S.-Iranian relations, and perhaps world peace, depends on the answers to these questions. The United States should be prepared to reach a geopolitical understanding with Iran based on Westphalian principles of non-interference, and to develop a compatible concept of regional order. Before the Khomeini Revolution, Iran and the United States were de facto allies, and this alliance was based on a sober assessment of national interests, a view held by American presidents of both parties. Iranian and American national interests were perceived as coinciding. Both countries opposed the regional dominance of a superpower, which at the time was the Soviet Union. Both demonstrated a desire to respect each other's sovereignty in their Middle Eastern policies. Both supported the economic development of the region, even if only in a partial, fragmentary way. From the American point of view, there is every reason to restore such a relationship. Tension between Iran and the U.S. arose as a result of Tehran's adoption of jihadist rhetoric and direct attacks on American interests and the system of international order. How Iran synthesizes its complex heritage will depend largely on internal dynamics. In a country so culturally and politically complex, these dynamics appear unpredictable to outside observers and are not subject to the influence of external threats or entreaties. Whatever face Iran presents to the world, the fact remains, Iran faces a choice. It must decide whether it is a country or a cause. The United States should seek cooperation and encourage it in every way.
But the persistence and determination of Western negotiators, certainly a necessary condition for such an evolution, are not enough to ensure the desired outcome. Iran's cessation of support for groups such as Hezbollah would be a significant and fundamental step toward restoring constructive bilateral relations. The question is whether Iran sees the chaos on its borders as a threat or as an opportunity to realize a thousand-year-old dream. The United States must develop a strategic understanding of what is happening. Administration officials explaining the diminishing American role in the Middle East speak of a balanced system of Sunni states, plus perhaps Israel, as a counterweight to Iran. Even if such an entity were to actually emerge, its viability can only be guaranteed by an active American foreign policy. For the balance of power is not static, its constituent parts are in constant motion. The United States is necessary as an arbitrator, and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Therefore, it is essential that America remains closer to each of the rivals than they are to each other, and does not allow itself to be drawn into geopolitical games, especially in their extremist forms. By pursuing its own strategic goals, the United States can become a key factor, perhaps the only one, on the basis of which Iran will determine what to choose, the path of revolutionary Islam or the path of a great nation, legitimate and acting within the framework of Westphalian principles. But America can only play this role if it stays and decides not to leave.
Vision and reality. The question of peace in the Middle East in recent years has been directly linked to high technology, that is, to Iran's nuclear program. There is no way to instantly or hastily resolve this problem or to prevent the emergence of these weapons. However, it is appropriate to recall situations where other, seemingly insoluble, crises in the Middle East created new perspectives in the region. Between 1967 and 1973, there were two Arab-Israeli wars, two American operations, a Syrian invasion of Jordan, a massive American aerial presence in the combat zone, several aircraft hijackings, and most Arab countries severed diplomatic relations with the United States. Nevertheless, a peace process began, which resulted in 3 Egyptian-Israeli agreements, culminating in the 1979 peace treaty. A disengagement agreement was signed with Syria in 1974, which remained in effect for 4 decades, despite the Syrian civil war. The Madrid Conference took place in 1991, restarting the peace process. In Oslo, the PLO and Israel signed an accord, 1993, and a peace treaty was concluded between Jordan and Israel in 1994. This was achieved because 3 conditions were met: an active U.S. policy, the abandonment of plans to create a regional order through the forced imposition of universalist principles, and the rise to power of leaders with a corresponding vision. 2 events from my personal experience symbolize such a vision. In 1981, during his last visit to Washington, President Sadat invited me to visit Egypt the following spring for the celebration of the return of the Sinai Peninsula. I remember Sadat paused and added, "No, not a celebration. That would be too insulting to Israel. Come 6 months later, you and I will climb to the summit of Mount Sinai, where I want to place a mosque, a church, and a synagogue side by side, as a sign of the peace that everyone needs." Itzhak Rabin, formerly the chief of staff of the Israeli army, was prime minister during the period when the first ever political agreement between Israel and Egypt was concluded, 1975, and later he and former defense minister, then foreign minister Shimon Peres, secured the peace treaty with Jordan, 1994. On the occasion of the signing of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty in July 1994, Rabin addressed a joint session of both houses of the U.S. Congress together with King Hussein of Jordan. "Today we are embarking on a battle which has no dead and no wounded, no blood and no terror. This is the only battle that is a pleasure to wage, the battle for peace." In the Bible, our book of books, peace is mentioned in various phrases 237 times. In the Bible, from which we draw our values and our strength, in the book of Jeremiah, Rachel's lament is cited. This is what she says: "Refrain thy voice from weeping, and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, saith the Lord. I will not refrain my tears for those who have died. But on this summer day in Washington, far from home, we feel that our work will be rewarded, as the prophet promised." Both Sadat and Rabin were assassinated, but their achievements and aspirations live on. To reiterate, doctrines of forceful intimidation challenge the hopes for world order, but when they are rejected, and not a moment sooner, a moment can arrive that is capable of leading to the breakthroughs described above, where vision triumphs over reality.